Our next presentation is brought to you by Palo Alto Networks. We've got the Chief Security Officer, Matt Chiodi. He is in charge of public cloud. Matt, it's all yours.
Hi, my name is Matt Chiodi, and I'm the Chief Security Officer of Public Cloud at Palo Alto Networks. I'm really excited to chat with you today about some of the trends that I've seen in the industry over the last 6 to 12 months specific to cloud security. So what we're going to do over the next couple of minutes is talk about those trends, and then I want to talk a little bit about some predictions that I think will come true over the next 6 to 12 months based upon those trends. So let's jump into it. One thing that I know for sure that I have seen is that cloud has absolutely modernized how software is being made in almost every organization that I speak with. Now, in my role, I have the unique opportunity to chat with literally hundreds of clients in multiple different industries across the globe. And what I've seen even in what you would think of some of the most mature and older organizations is that cloud has absolutely changed how they are making and developing software. In fact, I've seen multiple different industries and multiple different companies that now don't consider themselves perhaps a bank anymore or a manufacturer, but rather software developers and technology companies. Now, this all started probably 5 to 7 years ago when organizations realized they needed to change how they were developing software, and perhaps even more importantly, how fast they were releasing it. This all started with the move from waterfall to agile development methodologies. And again, this is something that most organizations started to go through in the last, I'd say, 3 to 5 years. Depends a little bit on the industry. And realize a lot of that came from, again, that need to release software faster. So think about a traditional ERP, Enterprise Resource Program, that would be in an organization. These apps are typically monolithic in nature, meaning that you have one app and it probably does 100, maybe even 1,000 different things. This need to move software faster has really led that charge toward microservices. So before you had these massive apps that did all these different things, but now we have containers, things like Docker, that have really driven this move towards microservices. So instead of one app doing 100 things, you now have a container typically running one microservice that does one thing specifically. And cloud has driven all of this. It's really pushed through that pace of innovation. So software has changed because of how cloud has really moved that innovation through in the organization. The next thing has to do with basically how organizations are building their cloud infrastructure. And perhaps for some of you who may not be as familiar, infrastructure as code templates are absolutely leading the way. And when I say that these infrastructure as code templates, or IAC, when I say that they're now the norm, that's really for DevOps teams. When it comes to security teams and security practitioners, a lot of times I've found that they're not quite familiar with them yet, or maybe even more importantly, how they can benefit security. For those that aren't as familiar, the infrastructure as code templates, they allow you to no longer have to log into a cloud provider's console and click here and click there. What they do is they allow you to create a recipe where you can say, I need this networking, I need this compute, I need this storage, and you define it once in code, and then you can reuse it multiple times. And every time that you create an environment from that template, it will look exactly the same. This is where there's a huge benefit for security teams, that they can create that standardization that they like so much. But unfortunately, I'm going to share with you in a couple minutes some cloud threat research that really shows that organizations from a security perspective are not yet fully leveraging infrastructure as code. So I mentioned just about how organizations from a security perspective are not yet fully leveraging these infrastructure as code templates. One of the teams that I have the privilege of leading here at Palo Alto Networks is our Unit 42 Cloud Threat Research Team. And what you're looking at here are some of the statistics from our February 2020 Cloud Threat Report. And what we did is we focused on some of the practices of DevOps, and specific to infrastructure as code templates, we wanted to go out and analyze every single publicly available infrastructure as code template that we could find. And we wanted to look at it to see what issues they could be creating in customer cloud environments. And so we literally downloaded hundreds of thousands of these templates from public sources like GitHub, and we analyzed them for security issues. And what we found, unfortunately, is that although cloud has brought innovation and that it has changed how organizations are developing software, it's also brought with it new security challenges. So the first thing that we looked at in these templates was just the makeup, right? So you've got AWS that has their cloud formation templates. You've got HashiCorp that creates a multi-cloud infrastructure as code template with their Terraform. And then you have other ones. So we analyzed all of those. And what we found was that about specific to the AWS cloud formation templates, we found that about 42% of those templates had at least one or more insecurity that was being created. And I want to call out here, this isn't something that AWS is creating. No, this is the actual users that are taking templates and creating them. So users are introducing these vulnerabilities in these infrastructure as code templates. So we found that 42% of these cloud formation templates are introducing one or more insecurity. Now, if your organization was using one of these templates, unfortunately, every time that they're reused in your environment, you are creating that security issue over and over again. And you're again creating it at scale. Now, a lot of times when we think about network security in the cloud, we think that perhaps maybe it's not as important anymore. But what we found is those organizations that are using infrastructure as code templates to create network access, we found that specific to SSH, which is a remote access administration tool, we found that 76% of the time, those workloads are being exposed to the public internet. This means that anybody on the internet can access this host and try to make authentication requests against it. Certainly not a best practice. The next area has to do with something that has gotten, unfortunately, many organizations in the news over the past 2 to 3 years, and that's cloud storage. So this is typically, think of blob storage. This is what we typically see in the news. Perhaps a developer has created a new bucket, and they've unfortunately, probably mistakenly, opened it to the entire internet. In this case here, we found by looking at these infrastructure as code templates that 60% of the time that the templates we surveyed are used, they actually have cloud storage logging explicitly disabled. This means if you had a security incident, it would be almost impossible to do any type of attribution to figure out if you were attacked, if the data was breached, 60% of the time. And the last thing has to do with compliance. Nearly every organization that I've worked with falls under multiple different types of compliance mandates. Could be PCI, HIPAA, or even GDPR. Every single one of those has some type of encryption requirement. Unfortunately, what we found from looking at the data was about 43% of the time, cloud databases were found to be unencrypted. That means that if you're configuring a cloud database, that it was expressly, the encryption was turned off expressly in the configuration. And if that's your organization, you would be out of compliance if you fall under those types of mandates. Now, one thing we know from these trends is that organizations are absolutely looking for how they can secure their cloud apps better. And so that a trend that I'm seeing is, we could perhaps characterize the first decade of cloud as being lift and shift. That was the first decade. How do I get things to the cloud as quickly as possible? But unfortunately, organizations that made that move in the past realized that their costs were actually much greater in the cloud. And so they're now looking at, and I'd say this has really changed over the last 2 to 3 years, they're looking at how do I rebuild my apps so they're cloud native? And so in order to build a cloud native app, there's many different components that go into that, right? You may have one app over here, you might have a mobile app, you might be using a cloud storage service, but each one of those is going to have multiple different tech stacks underneath it that support it. In fact, I've never seen a single cloud environment or a single customer environment that's just had VMs or that's just had containers. In fact, it's usually a mix. I see containers, I see VMs, and I see a use of PaaS-based services. And perhaps in those customers that are maybe the more forward-leaning, they are starting to really use serverless functions. So anytime that you build cloud native security, you need a way to be able to apply it consistently across all different form factors. And so this right here, these trends that we've talked about are really what's going to drive some of the predictions that I want to walk you through over the next couple minutes. It's these things here that are really, I think, going to cause some massive changes over the next 6 to 12 months. And I want you to be aware of them so you can prepare you and your organization to better meet them. So let's look at some of these predictions. So one of the things that I've found really interesting, I'd say over the last 3 years, is the buzzword machine learning. I think we've all grown very tired of hearing machine learning and artificial intelligence. And for all intents and purposes, there really hasn't been a lot of substance behind it. But I believe that over the next year, we are really going to begin to see some major advances specific to cloud security and cybersecurity in general. Let me give you 1 or 2 examples. The first has to do with machines being very good at dealing with massive amounts of alerts or data. Our human brain doesn't scale so well when it comes to dealing with millions of different alerts that are being generated by so many different cloud security tools. And so one way that machine learning and machines in general do very well is by synthesizing millions of alerts into meaningful, actionable, and perhaps even preventable things that they can do for you through machine learning. The second has to do specifically with identity and access management. When we go back and we surveyed literally hundreds of different publicly disclosed cloud security breaches, what we found is that almost every single one of them has at least one or more component where identity permissions are over permissioned. So you have a user who had access they shouldn't have had, or maybe they needed it for a small period of time, but it was not revoked. In these cases here, this is where we believe machine learning and a specific area called automated reasoning can really help organizations to understand the effective permissions of a user. And it's in those cases there where we think that machine learning will really help organizations to demonstrably reduce risk in their organization and specifically in cloud environments. Well, one thing we've been talking a lot about is just how cloud has really forced organizations to change how they develop software. And so the other prediction that I have is that increasing speed of DevOps is actually going to force security to shift left. Think about it. If your organization used to be one that perhaps released software maybe annually or even twice a year, that's no longer going to work in this world where things are moving so quickly, especially in a post-COVID-19 world. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I want to walk you through 2 scenarios that I think will really illustrate why I think this prediction will come true over the next year. So what we're looking at here is a traditional, not a traditional, but yet what we're seeing in modern software development. And typically at a very high level, and this is definitely oversimplified, but it typically falls into these 3 phases that you see: build, deploy, and run. In the build phase, you have your developers, they're working in their integrated development environments, they're writing code. And then in the deploy phase, this is when they submit it, it leaves their IDE, and it begins to move into the development pipeline. This is where smoke tests are run to make sure things come together, that integrations happen. And then eventually it makes its way out into runtime. Now, if we look at how most organizations, how they apply their security, unfortunately, it's not evenly distributed across these 3 phases. What you typically have happen is you have a development team that's been working on perhaps a new feature or some new functionality for perhaps a period of months. And then they release it, and there's a security checkpoint that has to happen. The security team runs a vulnerability scan, they find issues, and then it ultimately typically leads to massive frustration between the development team and the security team. And a lot of times the security teams, because they've only been brought in at the end and their tools are only focused on the runtime, unfortunately, that leaves security teams without a lot of context into what the application actually does. Now let's contrast this with a second scenario. In this case here, you have an organization that has evenly applied security across the entire development pipeline. So think about it. If we look back at the build phase, you have in that developer's IDE, this is an environment that they know. You're not making them come outside of their normal tooling or processes. What if you actually gave them plugins in that environment so that as they're writing code, if they're introducing a new vulnerability, let's say they're creating a new infrastructure as code template and they're creating a misconfiguration. What if you could give them an early warning system to say, hey, you're creating it? This would allow them to identify any type of vulnerable code before it even made it further down the CI/CD pipeline. Now let's talk about the deploy phase. Let's say maybe you didn't catch it while the developer was creating it, and now they've submitted that build. Maybe it's a new container that they've submitted to a registry. If you apply security uniformly across the development lifecycle, you should be able to scan that new container. And if there's a vulnerability that's introduced, you should be able to stop that build, actually fail it so it doesn't make it out into the production environment. And last but not least, you still need runtime security because systems tend toward entropy. Things change and new vulnerabilities are introduced. And so it's still important that you do that vulnerability scanning in production, but also that you're keeping an eye on runtime. What's actually happening when programs are executing within containers, within serverless functions? It becomes absolutely critical that you apply security evenly across all three phases. I believe that this trend here, this prediction will come true because if there's one thing we know about cloud, it's that change is constant. Now, this one here, I want to give you a real personal example from here at Palo Alto Networks. We know, and one thing that we have heard consistently from clients, I'd say even over the last 2 years, is that they have too many tools, too many alerts, and they want consolidated platforms that they can work in. And so I believe that, it seems like almost every day we hear about some new merger and some new acquisition that's happening in the cybersecurity space. But specific to cloud, I believe that what you have seen will only continue to build steam as organizations are looking for comprehensive platforms. Now, specific to cloud, you might hear two terms. One is a CNSP, that's a cloud native security platform. Or you might hear the term CNAPP, Cloud Native Application Protection Platforms. I believe that this move towards platform-based security will continue to build steam. Now, let me give you the example from Palo Alto. We've made a lot of news and a lot of investments over the past 2 years. We've made some radical investments. And the first one we made was back in March of 2018. We acquired Evident.io, which was the then leader in cloud compliance. And so very, very quickly after that, in October of 2018, we announced the acquisition of RedLock, which was the leader in multi-cloud threat defense. That was then quickly followed by the acquisition of the #1 leader in the container security space, Twistlock. At the same time, we simultaneously announced the acquisition of a smaller yet #1 player in the serverless security space, a company by the name of PureSec. And then most recently in December of 2019, we introduced the acquisition of Apparetto, which is focused on identity-based microsegmentation and zero trust in the cloud. All of these acquisitions took place over a relatively very short period of time, and we've seen others in the market attempt to replicate a similar strategy. All of these things at Palo Alto Networks has led to the development of our unified, comprehensive Prisma Cloud platform. And so I bring this up because I believe you'll continue to see this, because if there's one thing that I've heard very clearly from dozens and dozens of customers is that they don't want more tools to manage when it comes to the cloud. They want platforms that are multi-cloud and that support them uniquely across the entire development lifecycle, not just in one area like containers or serverless or platform security. They want contained, holistic platforms. And that's why we built and acquired and made native technology like Prisma Cloud at Palo Alto Networks. Now, this recording is happening in May of 2020, and we are currently right in the throes of COVID-19. But my prediction is that a lot of organizations, they saw a temporary slowing when it came to the demand for cloud transformation projects. But I believe this slowing is only temporary. In fact, we've already seen the demand greatly increase. So I think right now we are in what I would like to call the opportunity zone. And I think as a security professionals, I want to give you a challenge, which I'll get to in about 1 minute on this. But let's talk about this opportunity zone. I think this will give you a great opportunity to really step back and look at your cloud security program. Now, maybe you're in an industry that was hit particularly hard. It will come back. There will be new opportunities in the future. And so I think that what we're seeing right now is that cloud has absolutely proved itself as a platform that can scale amidst the time of global catastrophes. And it's this that's going to not only restore those demand for cloud transformation projects to what it was pre-COVID, but I believe it's actually going to make it even greater based upon the cloud's solid track record over the last few months. So here's my challenge to you as a security professional. Number one, I want you to use this time to reflect. Think about your cloud security program and ask yourself the question, are you positioned to address risk holistically in a cloud-native world post-COVID-19? What changes could you make? What changes could you make in your security program to be able to better address these types of challenges? And then the second area has to do with experimentation. If there's one thing that we know from looking at past events, it's that as we move out of these types of times, organizations have a higher acceptance for risk. In fact, they're looking for it because they're looking at how they can generate new revenue streams. I can guarantee you within your organization today, there's business units that are out there looking at new revenue streams. How can they create this? So the question for you as a security practitioner is, what changes could you make today to better prepare for a cloud-native future? Cloud will only be accelerated by the events that we're going through today. And then the last one has to do with taking the opportunity to transform. What new ground will you break as a security professional to get ahead of maybe some pent-up demand in your organization? We know that the pace will only get faster as we move beyond this current crisis. So how do you handle cloud-native security? Well, one thing we know is the only way to address it is by having an integrated and comprehensive approach. And as we talked about before, security, cloud-native security specifically, it has to be evenly applied across the entire development pipeline. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be bolted on and only done at runtime. And it has to be done in a way that builds trust between security and development teams. Now, unfortunately for many organizations, it seems that as they move software faster and faster, security is somewhat of an afterthought. But it can't be that way if you're going to do truly cloud-native security. And if there's one thing that we know about cloud, it's that change is the only constant. There's always something new coming, whether it be perhaps even in your own organization. Maybe you're looking at adopting containers, or maybe you did containers a year or two ago and you're now looking at serverless functions. The point is you need to be ready for this constant rate of change that is not going to slow down. This is why we have expressly built the Prisma Cloud platform here at Palo Alto Networks. And we look at it across really these four pillars that you see here. For us, it always starts with visibility. If you don't understand what apps and what resources you have in the cloud, it becomes really difficult to secure them. So we give you that multi-cloud visibility across all of the major cloud environments, as well as on-premise. And we give you the ability to put some of those cloud-native guardrails that we talked about in place so that if you see a condition, automatically, you can put that condition back to the way it was supposed to be. And we give you the ability to enforce those guardrails to understand your compliance. But then also from a compute perspective, we give you the ability to understand what's happening in runtime on hosts, VMs, containers, and within serverless functions. We give you the ability to understand, are there vulnerabilities that are being introduced? And then from a network perspective, network security, it still is important in the cloud, but how you do it is very, very differently. And we give you the ability today with Prisma Cloud to be able to enforce things like application level micro-segmentation, to be able to understand what's happening down at that network resource and be able to put policies in place to be able to enforce those things. And then last but not least, identity. We talked a lot about how just so many of the cloud security incidents over the past 1 to 2 years had identity as a core component to it. So within Prisma Cloud today, we give you that capability to be able to understand how permissions are being utilized and then be able to actually enforce permissions around those identity. We'd love to have you join us for a free 30-day trial of the Prisma Cloud platform. If you go to marketplace.paloaltonetworks.com, you can sign up for a free 30-day trial. And because Prisma Cloud is run as SaaS, there's nothing for you to install. So I encourage you to go out today, marketplace.paloaltonetworks.com, and sign up for free 30-day trial. Well, I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you so much, and have a great day.